can send the recording to other people.
So welcome to the second 2025 Well Shop, EmBODY WELLShop. And this one is around optimizing your self-care. And I like that there's a sort of subset of that phrase that is optimizing yourself, right? Because the full title is optimizing your self-care for your health and well-being. And so self-care is one of those buzzwords that we hear all the time. We say we're doing it. And I'm going to sort of challenge your thinking around it a little bit as it relates to how you're supporting your overall health and well-being through this thing that is called self-care. And so for those who are here attending, if you want to put in what maybe you thought this was going to be about, what you hope this was going to be about, and I would love to understand what brought you to this particular well shop, and what you're hoping to get out of it. So feel free to share. I'm excited. I'll share while you guys are sharing. I'm excited because I think of self-care, I think in some very different ways. And I'm excited to hear what you think about my approach to it, my way of thinking about it is. And hopefully, as a coach, I'm very focused on having you all leave with some practical ideas and strategies. And just as a preview, there will be a question at the end that says, what are you going to potentially do differently after leaving this? So again, with that lens, take in what I'm, pick up what I'm putting down, as some people would say. I don't think anybody says that anymore, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. And just think about how you can integrate it into your particular approach to self-care. All right. So with that, let's talk about the agenda today. And thank you for sharing. Someone shared, learn new ideas for taking care of oneself. So our agenda today. So first, I want to talk about why I am focusing on this topic, right? This is about wellness. I am a health and wellness coach. So self-care plays into that, I think, in some interesting ways. That's always my goal with these presentations, is to really kind of introduce you to maybe a different thing that you never thought about or hadn't thought about in that particular way. So hence the next one, which is thinking differently about self-care. So is there a right way to do self-care, right? And that'll have a little bit of a play on words. And then this concept of being selfish. So your selfish self. And thinking differently about what dimensions are incorporated in how you think about self-care. And then these special considerations for women, which I am a specialist in women's health. And so I really, I will always have a special consideration for women. And then we'll talk about what's next, right? Again, I'll ask you, what are you going to do differently coming out of this, so that you can get self-care, quote unquote, right, or optimize it for your health and well-being. Okay. All right, let's start with why self-care. And the Oxford Dictionary, I'm going to take a dictionary definition, and then I want to kind of explore that a little bit, right? Because this is also something that we don't do a lot, which is to think about. We throw, again, it's a buzzword, and we don't think about what it means, and in that, make it more intentional, right? So why self-care? The practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. So I'm going to break that down a little bit. And I'm going to start with the end, because this concept of periods of stress, and this is how I want to relate it to your health and well-being, right? I'm going to ask you a question. According to research, what is the estimated percent of doctor's visits that have a stress-related source? What do you think? You can put it in the chat or you can shout it out. What is the percent of doctor's visits that have a stress-related source? So how is stress playing into your health and well-being, or how much is it affecting? What's the estimate? All right, I have an estimate of 80%. Anyone else? And there is a range. So you have a high likelihood of getting this correct. So the answer is actually 60 to 90%. And my personal opinion, just based on what I've seen with clients, et cetera, is that it's towards that higher end. That stress is one of the most underappreciated and underacknowledged contributors to our health challenges. And reasons that we may visit the doctor intentionally. Okay, so that's one thing, right? That's that concept of stress, which is often thought about with respect to self-care. I'm going to also talk about protecting one's own well-being and happiness. So self-care, what's the first word in self-care? Self. So I challenge you to think about, okay, and this gets to this, we'll talk about this whole selfish self. Who else can really take care of our own well-being and happiness? And who's responsible for it, ultimately? So again, right, this is hopefully going to get you to start thinking about your approach to self-care. Next, taking an active role. So this is, what happens when we don't take an active role? You know this from other things, right? When you passively, things just happen. You are not able to sort of make a difference. So it's really important that you take an active role. And this is going to be what we'll talk about, is how can you be active about your self-care and not kind of just use it as a checklist. And then lastly, this concept of a practice, which goes with the active role, right? Because you want to actively practice. What happens when we don't practice our role, right? The things don't turn out the way that we want. If we practice, say practice makes perfect. I don't think there is such a thing as perfect, but we get closer to the outcomes that we want when we practice. And there is a difference between an activity and a practice, right? There are self-care activities, but ideally we get to the point that we're practicing it, right? When we practice something, we get good at it and our results are better. All right, so that's exploding this concept of self-care. Does anyone think there's anything missing from this definition? Is there anything that when you think of self-care, that's the thing that comes to you and it's not in this definition? And I love the little dog because the little dog's looking at you like, yeah, you should be taking care of yourself. All right. So why and what do you need to know? So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about this concept of right self-care, selfish self-care and self. And also this concept of a multidimensional approach, right? There are multiple dimensions of wellness. And there are also there's one actual special consideration for women that I want you to think about. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphics. First, we're going to talk about the illness wellness continuum. And we are going to just make sure that you are able to. All right, there's this concept of this illness wellness continuum. There is a researcher that came up with this, and it is where there's a spectrum from premature death to high level wellness. And within that, right, you've got kind of a neutral point where you're kind of just okay. You don't have any illness, but you wouldn't say that you're particularly well either, right? So on the left, if you will, is the treatment paradigm. So that's where, in all honesty, you probably need the assistance of a illness professional. I'm not even going to call it a healthcare wellness. It's an illness professional, right? Because you've got either signs, symptoms, you have some level of disability, and you don't want to keep going to the right. to the left, excuse me, because this is about the left versus the right. You see where I'm headed here, right? On the right side, right, that's where the right, literally and figuratively, self-care happens. It's where you have the ability to make a difference and bring yourself closer to this concept of high-level wellness. You can build awareness. You can get educated. You can invest in your growth. And that's where coaching can assist, but you are really at the center, because with coaching, you're always at the center. Now, with the treatment paradigm, they're going to do the things that they think are right for you. But really, your ability to take control is in that right side. Now, the second one, this second continuum is this self-love continuum. And I use the illness wellness continuum as a sort of inspiration for this. And so there's this neutral point, which is similarly, you're neither self-harming nor truly self-loving, right? You're not, your esteem is you feel okay. You know, you're not self-sabotaging. You don't have a particular, this is really dealing with your emotional and your mental. So that's where, again, a professional comes in handy, right? You get therapy. But on the other side, right, you've got self-awareness, self-acceptance and compassion, self-appreciation, and hopefully you're moving towards the right to deep self-love. And these things, again, they share this kind of common middle point, which is this neutral point that most of ourselves find ourselves in. But as you move to the right, that's where the right self-care is. So again, you'll see the parallels between the illness wellness, so kind of the physical health, and the self-love continuum. And it's all about awareness and education and growth, both physically and emotionally. So again, where the right self-care happens is on that right side, right? Where you can play the most active role. Remember we talked about an active role in protecting your own well-being and happiness. And the idea is to realize that getting past the midpoint is where you can play an active role. So if you find yourself on the left before the midpoint, you're gonna mostly benefit from some professional treatment, therapy, etc. But when you are at this midpoint, right, that's where self-care begins to really, really take effect. Okay, so our healthcare system, our illness system is very good at when you're sick, but not when you are not. So to go from just okay to high-level wellness, deep self-love, that's where you can make a difference. All right. So let me ask something. So that's kind of the right self-care. So the right self-care is based on where you are and where you're ready to go. So how often does your self-care feel selfish to you? When does the word, how often does that happen? When you think about self-care, do you think it's being selfish? Because this is really about getting to the root of something that, I'm going to make a distinction between something feeling selfish to us and something that appears selfish to others. Right? What feels more true to you? So again, this is about thinking about self-care differently. If you are thinking that your self-care is selfish, my proposal to you is that something goes amiss when we are not rooting our self-care from a place of genuine self-love. So there's some work we want to do, or maybe some play, to change that so that we don't see our self-care as selfish in the negative sense, right? As selfish in the sense of I'm prioritizing my needs over or at the expense of others, but that I'm prioritizing my needs for others, right? Because it's essential for me to show up fully for those people. All right, so this is the key. If you are in the space, so these are some questions that you're going to ask yourself is, where am I in terms of how I feel about self-care? and whether or not it is selfish. Because if it's selfish in the sense that you are afraid of what others are thinking, and you, oh, I don't want to be selfish. I'm going to encourage you to, yes, you do, because you want to make sure that you yourself are taking on that active role to protect your health and well-being. And one thing that I will tell you is to flip it and think about, if someone thinks that it's selfish of you to do that, to take an active role in protecting your health and well-being, then who's the one who's being selfish? All right. Any thoughts, comments, questions? I would love to, right? My idea is shifting into a self-love mindset. You can realize self-care is positively selfish and ultimately self-loving. Because remember, the name of the practice is self-care. So it's about yourself and can only be done by who? Yourself. All right. All right, so let's talk about this concept of a multidimensional approach. Now, I hope that you believe in the relationship between the mind and the body, the emotional and the physical, right? We talked about the importance of stress and self-care, and how particularly in those times of stress. And the reason why that's the case is because stress is actually an emotional response that triggers a physical response, right? So it is literally the manifestation of the connection. And so there is this thing that I'm going to propose to you, is that to optimize your self-care, you have to honor that how you feel physically and emotionally are inseparably linked. So anything that you do that you consider to be self-care should, to optimize it, incorporate a physical and an emotional component. If you do something physically that doesn't make you feel good, I know that a lot of people talk about exercise as self-care. Well, if you're doing it just because you think you're supposed to do it, but you really don't like doing it, it's not something that you like an aqua Zumba or getting on the treadmill, if you really like, or getting outside and walking and running. If it is not both physically and emotionally making you feel cared for, right? Self-care, loved, and helping reduce both your emotional and your physical stress, you're not optimizing this understanding and honoring of this physical and emotional, right? Whether you feel good or bad physically is interdependent with how you feel good or bad, whether or not you feel good or bad mentally and emotionally. So superficial activities, remember we said, let's get away from activities and talk about a practice, do not satisfy the emotional side. So think about what practices, what things can satisfy your emotional and physical response, right? True well-being, that high-level wellness, that deep self-love, emerges when your self-care nurtures both your body and your mind, making you feel loved, cared for, and less stressed physically and emotionally, right? Because those two are interplaying. Because again, how you feel physically and emotionally are inseparably linked. All right. So the special consideration for women. Any ideas on what this is? I'm always kind of interested. What in the context of self-care do you think could be different around how women do it and how women can optimize it? Any thoughts? All right, I'm just going to give it away. So the special consideration for women is something called the tend and befriend response. Has anyone ever heard of this? So it is a research concept that came out of research around stress. And in women, tend and befriend is a stress response that encourages us to exhibit nurturing behavior, to leverage our social bonding, to help us alleviate stress and boost well-being. And it is something that does not show the same benefit for men in terms of reducing stress. So what this says is that our social relationships are absolutely critical to and can play a significant role in helping us within this self-care. So again, when you're looking at what you're doing, what your practice is, how you're playing an active role in your own and maybe someone else's, and it will benefit you both, how's that tend and befriend response a part of how you're thinking about your self-care? And I really love this picture. It's making me really, I mean, maybe that's another thing you could do, is find pictures that you like of women coming together. Because again, this concept of, nurturing and social bonding actually is beneficial for us in particular. All right. So how can you optimize and personalize your self-care practice? What I'm suggesting is that when you're thinking about your self-care, and remember, key word here is self. So your self-care is going to look very different than others because it has to do with your emotional, your mental, what works for you in terms of, as we said, reducing stress, and what makes you feel loved and cared for. People have love languages. There should be something, and maybe that's my next book, called self-care languages. What is your self-care language? Because in order to optimize it, you have to personalize it. It has to be about how you respond, right? How you emotionally respond, how you physically respond. And that's going to be different for everyone. And my proposal to you is that you can ask yourself a couple of things. Am I in the right place? So be honest with yourself. Are you currently to the right of that midpoint, or at least at the midpoint? Sort of in this place of being ready to lean into high-level wellness, self-love, as opposed to backing away from illness and self-harm. Because if you're in that left side, you're not in the right place, right? So be honest with yourself. If you've got signs and symptoms physically, if you've got, really some things that you want to work through emotionally or mentally, then do that with a professional. That is the care that you need, right? You're not really invest in self-care for that sort of growth towards that high-level wellness and self-love. And that itself is caring for you, but you need help. It needs to be a mutual and partnered effort. So the second question, so you got to be in the right place. And then when you're going to do it, are you thinking about selfish in the right way? Are you rooted in self-love, and are you guilt-free about prioritizing your well-being and happiness? Or do you have that kind of lingering, well, I'm prioritizing it, but I'm prioritizing it over others? I'm telling you, there is no such thing when you are rooted in self-love. Some people may disagree and say, oh, well, you can always prioritize over other people. Well, again, if it's your needs, right? There's no one that can say that's more important than that. So again, if you're rooted in self-love, you will know that, and you will not feel guilty, feel bad about protecting, taking an active role in your well-being and happiness. All right, third, the right focus. So once you know I'm in the right place, I have the right sort of mindset about doing this for me, then what am I going to do? Am I maximizing both the physical and the emotional? So am I maximizing that connection in what I do, not only intentionally for self-care, but day to day, right? This is something that is, I am going to challenge you with, and I have something to help you with that. Because the other thing about being in the right place, when you wait until you are burned out, depressed, something is hurting, then you're not in the right place for self-care. Because that's not self-care, that's like an emergency. That's, you got to address, remember, you're now left of the midpoint. So this is about maintaining, protecting, not allowing your well-being and your happiness to be eroded and for you to sort of fall into that left side. So that it has to be day to day. Self-care is not a point in time, emergency, because that means you didn't protect. Stress and all of the other things, emotions, all the other things that happen to us have taken over. All right, so once you have the right focus on your day-to-day activities, your special activities for self-care, do you have the right support? So are there, again, for women, people in your lives, are you surrounding yourselves with those who not only support you, but honor and encourage your self-care, and I'm going to add now self-love efforts, because that's going to keep you in the right place with the right mindset around what the good, guilt-free, selfish, keeping you with the right focus. And so that's what allows this to be a cycle that will continue to work. All right. So I'm going to ask the question that I asked earlier. What is one thing that you'll take away from today's discussion, or that you'll do differently based on today's discussion? So again, it could be something, as we talked about, emotional, something physical, something, what are you going to do differently based on today's discussion? So just let me know. Because for me, this is something that I think about, and I'll tell you, this was in a previous newsletter that I sent out. I create moments for emotional and physical release. I'll call it that. Right? When something happens that is good, I bring my physical and my emotional to it, and I actually amp it up. And this is one of the ways that I personally do, sort of day-to-day self-care. So if something happened, and I'm not going to tell you what happened today because it actually is a little gross, but I was very, very thankful. And I just was like, yes! Even though it was this little, really small thing, right? I brought it into my body and amped up the emotion to be like, oh my goodness, thank you, 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 thank you. So literally just maximizing that so that it plays a role in my day-to-day. And for those of you who've joined me for laughter yoga, laughter is a great way. And laughter plus this sort of tend and befriend, right? Find those people, those women that you can kind of release with, those social connections. So anybody have anything they want to share? If not, that's fine. So as we're moving towards this concept of high-level wellness and deep self-love, the next steps that I'm going to offer to you is you can visit embodywell.com. And we currently, as part of February, because self-care is important for your heart health, which if you haven't seen our heart health well shop, which we did in January, this is Heart Health Month. So please check it out. It's on our YouTube channel. There's a free email course, 5 days to embody love. So you will receive an email every day that gives you some things to think about, right? The emotional side. And then you can integrate that with something physical So there's a free email course, 5 Days to Embody Love. You can also email me, Tanya@embodywell.com, if you're interested in receiving our virtual coach newsletter, where we talk about a lot of these things, a lot of the stuff that includes, sort of the integration of the emotional and the physical. And starting with the emotional is where you start to bring some of that stress down. So that's one of the reasons why I do my little celebration. You can also email me if we're launching this month our online course for Embody Love. And also we have a guided journal. So if you want to sort of invest more in awareness, right? Acceptance, compassion, growth, education about yourself, then that's a great tool for that. And you can follow me on Instagram at Embody Well. But yeah, I highly recommend the email course. It's free, it's 5 days. And again, you'll have it if you want to do it over time. I find that you can always spend more time on stuff like that. So with that, I hope that there was something that changed for you or that clicked, something new that you learned, at least one thing. And I hope that it will contribute to you taking a more active role in protecting your health and well-being, particularly during times of stress, and making it into a practice that is continuous and not just kind of when it's to the left of the midpoint. So do the right step. All right. And with that, I will take you back to, and I will stop the recording and we can kind of have a little discussion.